So you mentioned, we're going to get into your being a teenager. You mentioned you had a bar mitzvah.
Yes.
Was this still at the Riverdale Jewish Center?
That's correct, yep.
And did I assume you invited all your extended family who could come? What about children, other kids your age?
My mother was very sure to invite as many friends of mine as we could. At that time, it was almost unheard of to have like one of the bar mitzvahs they have now, you know, with a pile of kids. But I really did have a pile of kids at my bar mitzvah. My mother found that very important, you know, so I was able to invite all my friends. And, you know, as well as kids I didn't like that much who were, you know, part of the family or friends of close family and stuff like that. You know, it's kind of close-knit that way. Yeah, but it was a pretty big bar mitzvah.
And by then you were going to 141 for
right.
junior high school.
Yes, yes.
Did that expand your group of friends, being in a bigger school?
You know, I started between 141 and then John F. Kennedy. I started to, you know, for the first time really, you know, meet black and Puerto Rican kids and stuff like that. And, you know, while there's still a lot of cultural differences, you know, me from Eastern European parents, you know, or a friend Juan Agasto from Ponce in Puerto Rico, or my friend Calvin Pinkney from Harlem, you know, is kind of, you know, we weren't tight. You know, even though they'd come to the house sometimes or something, you know, that was a little bit of a new and alien experience, I think, for me and my parents, you know. But I tried, you know.
Did you ever discuss your parents with your friends or in school? Was there ever any discussion of the Holocaust or what may have happened to people?
You know, it's such a weird, it was such a weird time growing up. You know, if you think about it, I was in junior high, 141, between 1969 and 1972. I was at Kennedy between 72 and 75. I can't even remember one single discussion of the Holocaust. I would say that my time at 141, if there was any thought about anything other than, you know, basketball or girls or anything like that, it was about the Vietnam War, right? That seemed all-consuming. There was the Vietnam War, there was civil rights. You know, people would talk about that stuff, me included. I just didn't think in terms of the Holocaust, you know, being, you know, so...
As you were going through junior high and high school, did your parents talk to you any further, or did you start asking them any questions?
You know, still not yet. You know, really, you know, I mean, they would tell me a little more. They started to tell me stories. As I was getting older, I don't know if it was in public school or in junior high school that I realized, well, my grandparents are dead. You know, I knew that already, that they weren't around, but I didn't know how they died. And at some point, I'm not sure when, I must have realized that they had been murdered, you know. You know, and I don't remember quite how I processed it. I think, you know, it was really in college that it all hit me like a ton of bricks, you know. But at that time, it just didn't, I didn't focus that way. You know, I was more, you know, if you asked me political questions or anything, you know, I was very supportive of the state of Israel. You know, and when Israel kicked behind in 1967, we were all like, yeah, you know. And, you know, when they had the Yom Kippur War in 73, you know, my father went to give blood, you know, that's all we could talk about in synagogue, right? It started right on Yom Kippur, you know. So, you know, I was slowly getting more of this consciousness about it, but it really took a lot of time. And I think it corresponds a lot to the fact that in the world out there, and I don't know, Martha, and I know I'm not supposed to bring you into the discussion, but I don't know what your experience has been with Holocaust survivors during the 60s and 70s. It's my sense that they didn't quite speak about it in the same way as they did later, you know?
Well, there was nothing much in the media.
Yeah.
When the Diary of Anne Frank came out, did you Were you aware of that?
No. Oh, now I'm remembering something. You know what came out, and it was one of the first inklings. I don't know what year it came out, but when The Sound of Music came out.
Oh.
Sound of Music, right?
I think it was 64.
Was it 64? I must have seen it a little later, and I know I saw it in one of what they called showcase theaters at that time in Manhattan. You know, beautiful theater. And then we must have seen it a little later, because I remember it very specifically. But I remember the scene where she's running down the road. Julie Andrews is running down the road with the guitar after she leaves the convent in Salzburg or Linz or wherever the heck it was. And my father looks at that and says, I was on that same road, looting people's houses, looking for food and clothing. I go, what? And, you know, I can't watch that movie anymore, but that was just a shock to me. And, you know, I don't know if I kept it internally too long. I think another shock to me was at some point the movie, you know, it's funny how these things kind of bring it out. But, you know, and again, movies that you think was safe. This is a whole nother discussion, but there was so little that it was safe to see with my father. You know, he couldn't watch anything with gunplay. You know, he couldn't watch anything about prisons. Stuff like that. But, you know, so you'd think you'd go to see a safe movie like Sound of Music and bam, that would come out. Another movie we saw was Fiddler on the Roof. And not the scene you might be thinking about where there's the pogrom or the scene where they empty out the village at the end and all the people of Anatevka have to leave. But there's a scene in there where Tevye, you know, the main character of Fiddler on the Roof, is putting his daughter on a cattle car. I don't know if you remember that scene in the movie, but he's putting her on this very primitive train.
The daughter that was going to join her
boyfriend in Siberia.
Exactly.
And my father, he choked up. I couldn't believe it, you know. And again, I don't know how long that stayed with me, but obviously it stayed with me to this day. So, you know, I knew that was very powerful. Can't tell you what year, but I'm sure I was not in college yet.
There was a television series, Holocaust. It wasn't very good, but it was the first breakthrough on television.
Yeah.
Were you aware of that?
I was aware of that. That was huge. I remember that was very huge. It's hard to say when I saw it because I was in college between 75 and 79 and didn't have much access to a TV. But I do remember seeing it. I remember, you know, just being tortured. I couldn't wait for the scene where they showed resistance. I just couldn't stand it. It kept getting worse and worse and worse. But my father would never watch something like that. He would never bring himself to watch something like that. It would be torture for him. My mother, she would, if something like that was coming on, she would debate it, you know, or with herself, because she told me about these things later, and then and then I would, you know, this sometimes was later, but, you know, like in college, and I'd say, Ema, please don't watch it. Please don't watch it. Don't do that. You know, why are you doing that? You know this law. You don't have to see it. This is for people who don't know, you know. And sometimes she said I couldn't, or I walked out, and sometimes she would tell me, Arnie, I sat and watched it all. You know, yeah.
To go back just a minute, when you were a child, you had this dread of walking past their room at night because you must have been frightened when they'd start screaming.
Oh, I was terrified.
Terrified.
I was terrified.
What about when your father burst out with these stories out of nowhere?
Yeah.
Did that scare you? I mean, what did you make of that?
You know, first I was shocked, you know, and even sitting there at the table, even if it didn't stay with me, there was kind of both an anticipation and a dread in hearing what he would say. You know, sometimes you'd almost get like that shiver that goes up your back or spine. You know, and you know, again, he'd say things that were so out of any context that we were dealing with, but these terrible things.
And he'd always make it clear that this happened to him.
Yes. Yes, it was always about him. You know, and there were stories about him growing up, and there were stories about ghetto, and there were stories about, you know, Auschwitz and Ebensee. Again, they weren't that constant, but they were there. And don't get me wrong, even sometimes my father could tell a funny story, you know, from his childhood, or of, you know, even of something in Israel. You know, so occasionally there was a funny story too. He also spoke of some of his experiences in Israel, you know, in the military there, and on kibbutz, you know, some funny stories. But usually his were more difficult. And again, my mother, she would, you know, at other times she would tell me stories again about her growing up. She would sing me Romanian folk songs and other things like that, you know.
And that you like to hear,
I love
her
that.
stories.
Yeah, I like to hear her stories, you know, of her growing up, you know, of, you know, this boy who liked her, or, you know, the trouble she got into with her friend, you know, how she was mischievous, you know. I love those stories.
Did they tell you about your grandparents, the people who were gone?
Yes, you know, they told me some things about them, you know, mostly, you know, that, you know, from my father, that, you know, his parents were already very old. He was among the second youngest of 9, so they were already in their 70s, you know, when he was in his early 20s, but, you know, how they were just very, very poor. You know, but he did tell me some things, that his father was a tailor and very devout. You know, that his mother just worked very hard between 9 kids in a little house with 2 rooms.
This is when you were little. He
Little,
would tell you
yeah.
these things.
Yeah.
But at that point, you didn't know what had happened to them. You just knew they weren't here.
Yeah, exactly.
They were dead,
yeah,
but
yeah.
you
They were
weren't
dead, and I wasn't sure. And I knew about World War II. You know, I mean, there was combat and other things on TV, and at some point there was Hogan's Heroes, and that was pretty intense. And you know, I would say, look how funny they are. You know, the Germans and stuff. You know, and look at this. And you know, my father just, you know.